We have a massive Texans free agency update as the interior offensive line has not been the best for this past season, and the Texans are expected to land an all-pro, and it could get really real. So Shaq Mason and Kenyon Green have kind of been the interior pieces for the Texans for a while. Titus Howard has moved from tackle to guard, so it's most likely looking like Titus Howard is going to play the inside left guard, as well as Laremy Tunsil on the left side. So you need to bring in somebody to kind of fill the void. Shaq Mason's getting older. And how about an all-pro guard who's a little bit older, but could do really well, and that's Zach Martin. He is getting older. He did allow 5 sacks last year, so he'll be 35 before the season begins, and definitely not a terrible idea. Texans predicted to land Zach Martin, and I actually personally don't mind it. You bring in a guy who's got a lot of experience, and the only problem is he's declining. He's on the tail end. Before those 5.5 sacks that he gave up last year, he had a total of 12 sacks throughout his entire 11-year career. So you can see, as he's getting up there with age, he's also kind of taking a couple steps back, because through 2021 to 2023, he only allowed 6 sacks over that period of time. So there's a lot to love from Zach Martin, but the PFF grade, 65 overall grade at the bottom. Shaq Mason had a 61. So again, not much of a drastic difference in terms of the two veterans you're getting. I feel like Zach Martin definitely a little bit better, but he's a short-term kind of plug and play, right? He's going to be 34, 35. How long can you actually put him on a contract for? That's the question. However, what does Nick Caserio do right now to fill the kind of offense, right? They don't have a lot of cap space. You could sign a bunch of veterans like Zach Martin on a 1-year contract. You have Juwan Jennings. You could go out and get him at wide receiver. But there's a lot to worry about on the offensive line, and that's kind of the thing I would love to address. They're most likely going to keep everyone on the offensive line. But if you're going to get rid of one player, that is Shaq Mason. Shaq Mason he was injured last year, so we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But Kenyon Green, who was drafted middle of the first round a couple years back, has not lived up to the potential that he has been supposed to be. So Kenyon Green kind of has to go. But he's on a rookie deal. If you trade him before June 1st or after, it's all of that depends on. Free agency is interesting because you break it down. Nick Caserio can do all these moves. I still don't understand how cap space works, because teams can restructure deals and then all of a sudden the Chiefs can go out and sign big players, and then if they have a signing bonus, it pushes it back. So there's all this weird, crazy things that just can make contracts seem a little bit misleading, right? Trevor Lawrence gets $50 million a year, but that $50 million doesn't come until the 2-3 years down the line with the way his contract is set up. So same thing with Christian Kirk a few years ago. He was getting $21 million a year, but again, that $21 million didn't come if he wasn't the wide receiver 1 for 2 years. So again, a lot of misconstrued stats in terms of how much money players are actually getting. You look at the guaranteed money, that's where the cap hit as Laremy Tunsil, $28 million. So the Texans have to figure it out, because you can't have 3, 4, 5 different players, $20 million, $28 million, 23, 18. It's going to get up there in price. So if you want to go sign a veteran wide receiver, do you re-sign Stephon Diggs? All this kind of puts down to who do the Texans want to go after? If you want to go after 1-year kind of all-pro tackles in guards like Zach Martin, like that's not a terrible idea, but what is the ultimate goal here for Houston, right? If I'm asking you guys, you would say the goal is to win a championship, right? The goal is to, 1, get to the AFC championship. We've never been to a championship game. We haven't made it past the divisional round in a while, still defeated in the divisional round. But, I mean, get to an AFC championship game. If you're going to do that, I don't know if signing Zach Martin for 1 year is going to be the best fit. Joel Bitonio, Trey Smith, there's a lot of good tackles and guards that you can kind of get to fill the void. Because if you look at the depth chart for the Texans, Blake Fisher is the right tackle. Jarrett Patterson, Juice Scruggs have been the guys taking the snaps. Shaq Mason. So the whole right side of the offensive line has kind of been bad. Blake Fisher will give him the benefit of the doubt because he's a rookie. Maybe he can develop a little bit more. But if you look at underneath the right tackle, there's nobody to back up Blake Fisher. So that's not very appealing, right? You could try and sign maybe a bigger name. I'm not really too sure if you're looking at what do you get on the offensive line because you can't sign anyone crazy. So a lot of tough situations for the Texans to be in. The left side, the blind side, is kind of locked down, right? Laremy Tunsil, unless you trade him to free up some cap space, that would be the only thing I would consider because he's getting older as well. So it looks like the Texans' championship window for a Super Bowl is kind of closing, and that's not good. So you got C.J. Stroud, great quarterback. Awesome guy. Drafted him second overall. Joe Mixon, it was a great pickup. Tank Dell is injured. Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins. The offense is there, but the offensive line and the second most sacked team in football, we can put the blame on Bobby Slowick, but we don't actually know that until we see the team play next year. Now, I love the way Nick Caley, new offensive coordinator, I love the way he's kind of figuring it out, saying, hey, I'm so excited to work with this group. I'm excited to try new things. And it's kind of all words that you would expect in terms of the press conference, but there's good news to like there. And when going back to Zach Martin, I don't hate it, but what do you do to kind of make a drastic move? Do you trade up for Emeka Egbuka? What big moves are the Texans going to make? Because I was under the impression that this was going to be a firework type of offseason, and I'm starting to think, like, if we're interested in going after Zach Martin, and again, no offense to Zach Martin, love him, all pro, but he's also 34, he just allowed 5 sacks this past season, how much gas does he have left in the tank? It's definitely going to be a tough situation for the Texans, because you look at the offensive line, very much needed. You look at the wide receiver core, you can't just have Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs. You need somebody else there. The names that the Texans are supposed to go after: DeAndre Hopkins, old veteran. We know what Hopkins was for the Texans, but he's not that guy anymore. Zach Martin, 34. Do you bring in all these veterans and try and think that that's what's going to make you a Super Bowl caliber team? I don't think so. So hypothetically, I'm asking you guys, if we bring in DeAndre Hopkins, Zach Martin, and a couple names to kind of round out the secondary that are, older names, that guys that are veterans, do we think we can win a Super Bowl? I'm going to lean to no. And I say that because we saw what the Texans' offensive line was this year, and if they're not able to improve that, like, maybe you go up and... The only thing I'm expecting that's big for the Texans this year is they're going to trade up and draft Emeka Egbuka. That would be pretty insane. However, the money to get anybody this offseason to try and improve the offensive line, it's hard to say that you're going to drastically improve if you're going after veterans that are declining. So that's the only problem with the Texans, and love the fact that they're pursuing an all-pro guard. I love the fact that they're going after DeAndre Hopkins. This is not bad stuff. It really isn't, especially if you can get these guys on cheap veteran contracts. That's good. But the problem is you have other bigger names like T. Higgins, Trey Smith. I wouldn't even mind Joel Bitonio as a guard. But there are some names that you can look for in the offseason, and I'm just saying, if we can somehow figure out this cap space, because you look at how many players are under contract that are just getting a ridiculous amount of money. And I don't mean that in any disrespect to the contract that they've been able to receive. But Shaq Mason, a $14 million cap hit. Get rid of him. Dalton Schultz, a $14 million cap hit. We don't need a tight end under contract for $11 million guaranteed. I love Dalton Schultz. He's been great, but we don't utilize the tight end enough. If you're going to have a 2 tight end set with the offense and the way Nick Caley did it on the Rams, go for it. Use Stover. Use Schultz. But you can't do that without an offensive line. So I actually, looking at the offseason for the Texans, guard is not a bad idea. But you have to improve this offense. I don't believe an offensive coordinator in Nick Caley is just going to superficially, all of a sudden, this offense is going to wake up. I don't think that's how it works. Just because you have one problem that you think is the offensive coordinator, Bobby Slowick, you just replace him and you don't do anything in the offseason. Hypothetically, of course, the Texans just lay low in the offseason because they don't have any money, sign these veteran guys. Is the offense going to look that much better because of a new system? It's tough to say. So, how do you guys feel? Zach Martin to the Texans. I don't hate it, but again, there's other names that I feel like you could go after. So, tough decisions to make for the Texans. Now that I'm thinking about how Nick Caley's going to run that offense, I mean, Caley could do a lot, and Schultz, $14 million a year. I would like to ship him. But that tight end room is pretty deep, so if you could utilize a Higbee and Parkinson like the Rams did, because that was their tandem for years. So it's definitely a tough decision to kind of look forward to, especially when you look at the fact that the Texans were struggling on the offensive line last year. The Texans were struggling to find a healthy receiver. You look at Tank Dell went down, all these guys, and Higbee and Parkinson, the duo that they had at tight end with the 1-2 they had in Nakua and Kupp, and you bring in for the Texans, I'm saying if you bring in, which is what I'm expecting. So for this team, final thoughts when wrapping it up. I know this is supposed to be Zach Martin coming to the team, but you have to look at everything in retrospect. We don't have a lot of money, and looking at this team, it's like, how do Nick Caserio and this offense kind of sculpt around what is the scheme for this year for Nick Caley? And looking at the Rams offense compared to the Texans, this can very well be a top 10 offense, top 5 offense, and that's why they fired Bobby Slowick, because he was 19th in the league in a lot of middle-of-the-pack stats, and I'm not just looking at stats, but there was a lot of bad play calls that developed forever. But the one thing that you can do is kind of build your offense kind of how the Rams did. And I know Caley is a passing game coordinator, but looking at the team, you have a 2 tight end stack that you can use with Schultz and Stover. Hypothetically, if they don't spend any money, you go out and get Zach Martin. You go out and get a DeAndre Hopkins or the receiver on the Niners whose contract is up, Jawan Jennings. And you keep Stephon Diggs for another year or two, who's, yes, he's coming back from an ACL tear, but a veteran presence, knows this. Well, it's a new system, but he knows the locker room. He's been around these guys. He kind of has accepted that role and adapted to being a veteran leader, so that's another plus. And I'm just looking at Joe Mixon is all the way down here at the $9 million cap hit, but you have so many players making so much money. Like DeMeco Autry didn't even play half the season. I know there's no guaranteed money there, but do you cut Autry? There's so many things the Texans can do in terms of maneuvering this money around, and I'm just waiting for Caserio to open up the floodgates and say, all right, you're done, you're traded, and we have $50 million in cap space. But the likelihood of that happening is very slim to none. So unless the Texans make a big move to trade up for a receiver like Emeka Egbuka or try and draft an offensive line, I mean, there's that many good offensive linemen towards the end of the first round, and you could go after Ohio State tackle or there's a couple names. But for me, I'm just looking at the offensive line. Zach Martin would be a huge plus, but try and get some money first. Try and maneuver some contracts around. Try and talk to Laremy Tunsil about, hey, can you structure this deal differently here? Hey, and if you can be a genius in the salary constructed process, that can go a long way. So let me know your thoughts on the Texans situations for what they're going to do this offseason. Zach Martin would be a good plus. DeAndre Hopkins is not even a bad idea either. But to get all these veterans under contract, I don't know if it's the best idea in terms of winning a Super Bowl. Let me know your thoughts. But I appreciate everyone watching. This has been Texans Digest. Again, this is going to be a really weird offseason because I don't think the Texans are actually going to make any moves. But until next time, we'll see you in the next video.